We are here in Farmville, Virginia, on the lovely campus of Longwood University, home of the Lancers. To which you might say, Lancer? I hardly know her, but Tonight, this tiny college is hosting the one and only vice presidential debate. In just a few hours, Indiana Governor Mike Pence and home state Senator Tim Kaine will face off in a 90-minute hoedown, moderated by Elaine Quijano of CBS News. Few were expecting the same kind of riotous chaos we got last week from the debate between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. But by dint of its name alone, the Longwood debate is sure to feature plenty of jousting between Kaine and Pence as they defend the honor of their respective presidential nominees. So, Mark, what are you looking for tonight?
Well, this campus, like most college campuses, attracted a pretty raucous crowd. The students aren't in session now, but there are a lot of cheering protesters around, both for Clinton, against Clinton, for Trump, against Trump. You'll hear some of that throughout the show. Look, it has been said, and it is true. These two vice presidential nominees are mild-mannered. This is their moment in the sun. They'll probably not be talked much about after tonight. However, this is an opportunity for two guys who are less freighted by personality and the focus there, and to talk about the ideas that they're putting forward, their negative critiques of the other side. So I think we may get some clarity tonight about both policy and critique that doesn't come through often when Clinton and Trump are front and center.
Yeah, I mean, you've got it. It's interesting, right? Because Tim Kaine and Hillary Clinton agree about almost everything. Mike Pence and Donald Trump do not. And so I'll be interested in watching how Tim Kaine tries to exploit some of those differences. That's one thing. Second thing I'm looking for is I think it'll be a pretty substantive debate. These guys both know a lot about policy. They've been in government and politics for a long time. And the third thing is kind of watching Mike Pence try to do what I think is his one job tonight, at least having talked to a couple people who've been involved in his debate prep, which is literally the only thing. What would be a victory for Pence in their view is making voters a little more comfortable with electing Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, Pence, by his demeanor, by his ties to the establishment wing of the party, by his long-standing conservative issue positions, gives a lot of conservatives comfort, and tonight will be his chance to put that on display. And I think to put Hillary Clinton more on the defensive than Donald Trump did. I mean, I think Pence, unless Pence has a disastrous performance, he will, via Kaine, put her a little bit more on the defensive than Trump was able to do in the first debate, with few exceptions.
Well, it'd be interesting to see if Mike Pence debating Hillary Clinton directly, because in that situation he might be able to do that. I see what you mean. It's kind of kind of a conceptual defense. Of course, without her on stage, it'll be a little bit different. But, you know, I'm actually looking forward to this debate. I think, you know, a lot of people think it's going to be boring. I think it could be quite interesting.
Yeah, last thing I'll say is these are two likable guys. Not everybody in the country, to say the least, likes Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump.
Right.
And so it's maybe a breath of some fresh air for some viewers and voters. All right. 35 news cycles left until E-Day. There's new national polling today, and it continues the trend of what we've seen over the last few days from almost every recent survey. Hillary Clinton seems to have regained a meaningful edge over Donald J. Trump nationally and in most of the important battleground states. Clinton's up by 6 points, likely voters, in an NBC News SurveyMonkey national poll out today, 46 to 40%. That's essentially the margin she had in this four-way poll last month. Clinton also leading Trump by 4 points in a CBS News New York Times poll, 45 to 41. That survey had them tied in mid-September. Clinton's also gained ground in today's new state polls, the ones out today from Pennsylvania and North Carolina. This afternoon, in the debate spin room here at Longwood University, I got a chance to ask Clinton campaign chairman John Podesta about the views he has about the race overall, about the Electoral College math, and what it would take for Clinton, with a few weeks to go, to lose her advantage.
Look, we're taking nothing for granted. This has been a very long and grueling campaign, and so we're competing in all those in all the battlegrounds, and we'll be across this country from North Carolina and Florida to Nevada and Colorado as this campaign season wraps up. But we're just going to fight to win that 270 plus margin, and I think right now we feel like we're in a strong position to do that.
What would it take for you to lose? Would you have to make mistakes? Would he have to have a strong debate? What would be involved?
Look, I think that right now the direction of this campaign is in our favor, but we got to do everything we can to make sure that it stays that way. Right. You know, a lot can happen. You know, who knows what tricks are in store for us from either Mr. Trump or his allies,
or
here or abroad.
Assange. So, John, no doubt there's quiet confidence from quiet John Podesta there.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that where the polls are now publicly is about where the Clinton campaign thinks they have it and where they think it'll end up. Clinton with a 4 or 5 point lead nationally, winning the bulk of the battleground states. So, 4 years ago, the Obama campaign told us for months, we've got this. The numbers are stable, even after the bad first debate. How would you compare the level of confidence that John Podesta and his colleagues have now to the Obama campaign 4 years ago, when their confidence was extremely high?
3 words: similar, but less. And similar because they feel as though Donald Trump has never been in the lead, not from the beginning of the general election until today. Never has been in the lead, never has even been tied with Hillary Clinton, and she has a lot more past to 270 electoral votes. So, that stability is something that's similar. Less in that Mitt Romney was a much more predictable opponent than Donald Trump, and the level of enthusiasm in the Republican base and in the Trump movement for Trump is higher than it was in the Republican Party for Mitt Romney back in 2012, and things have just been crazier this cycle, so you can't be quite as secure as Barack Obama's people were then.
Their confidence is surprisingly high given the unpredictability. I'll say 2 other factors that undermine their confidence rationally. Maybe not as much as it should. One is, can Hillary Clinton inspire the coalition of the ascendant, young people, non-white voters, to turn out the way Barack Obama did? She just doesn't have the same ties to them, and they're relying on their desire to stop Donald Trump as much as anything else. The other thing is, Donald Trump at this point is on the track to win Ohio. And once you're not winning Ohio, you got to question the fundamental confidence you can have about the race, because Trump's on track potentially to win states that get him within hailing distance of 270.
Well, he's on
not all the way there, but
Yeah.
hailing distance. And so I would say their confidence, if you wanted to put, if the Obama confidence was 100%, and they pretty much were at 100%,
Right.
I put these guys at about 80%.
Well, that's why I say I think we're in agreement. Basically similar, but a little bit less.
I quantified it.
Yeah,
I went
I
80%.
know. You're with. I mean, look, I think they looked at, of all these polls that have come out, a poll that they believe in is the poll that had her up 4 in Florida, and a poll that has her up 4 in Florida. If they are confident of winning Florida, the race is over, and so that puts them very high. Again, you know. The thing about Obama, different from Hillary Clinton, was that even in the midst of the downturn, the economic downturn during the part of President Obama's first term, he was always a more popular figure, both with Democrats and in the middle of the country. And that is another thing that makes you a little nervous, because she's historically high in terms of her unpopularity, just a little bit less than Trump.
On the other hand, the thing that gives them in some ways more confidence was it was never clear what Mitt Romney's ceiling would be.
Right.
The Clinton campaign believes Trump's ceiling is maybe
42, 43,
44
right.
tops, and he's not going to win with 44 nationally.
100% right. All right, Donald Trump has spent far less on the television airwaves than Hillary Clinton has. But today, his campaign announced a new ad that Team Trump claims will start running in battleground state markets soon. So let's just say that it features a kinder, gentler Donald Trump that we're accustomed to seeing.
I love being a mom, but no matter how hard we work, we can't get ahead. Childcare costs have us stuck. Donald Trump is listening.
My child care plan allows for every family in America to deduct their child care expenses from their income taxes.
His child care plan makes a difference for working families. More money, more freedom. He's helping Americans just like us.
So, Mark, what do you make of this ad, and will its tone work for Donald Trump?
That could be a Democratic Party ad. It's going to infuriate the Clinton campaign, because they'll say this is a phony and a fake and not representative of Trump in demeanor or in policy. I think Republicans will look at that ad and say, that's a good ad, that's the kind of ad we need, and they will say, why didn't we raise the money to put ads like that on in August and not October?
I just think, you know, that one of the things this cycle has been true is that television advertising has just not moved very much so far on either side. Where Democrats have spent tons of money, they've had some massive advantage in terms of how much they've spent, and yet the basic dynamics of this race are being driven by these candidates who draw so much free media attention that I think the ad is fine. If that reflected the way Donald Trump campaigned, it might matter a lot. But it doesn't really reinforce the way that Trump is campaigning, and so I think it will probably not move the needle.
Yeah. If you look at, can Donald Trump win over married suburban women, white women? Ivanka, they're counting on. She's part of this identified with this policy of child care, and issues where Trump is more moderate than the Republican Party. Their criticism from the Clinton campaign about his child care program, but just trying to associate himself with affordable child care, is on the margins. If he's going to win this election, he needs that to drive that message. I have no idea how much they're spending on this ad, but I'll say again, you're right. TV ads don't matter in presidential races, but boy, is it late to be trying to drive that.
Well, I totally agree, but again, I mean, really the core thing to me is just, who cares about this ad if you spent the last week fat shaming some woman? Like, I mean, it's overshadowed. Like the amount of coverage nationally in the battleground states of what he did last week. This is like a drop, a thimbleful of impact in the ocean of coverage that Trump gets when he attacks some woman who's part of the demographic he's supposed to be appealing to with this ad.
It seems like a well-produced ad. I'll be interested to see if Democrats are the least bit threatened by it and feel like they need to respond, because it is a good ad. All right. We're going to have complete pregame and postgame coverage of the vice presidential debate live from here at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia. The coverage starts at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. It streams on Twitter. You can follow us at BPolitics to see it all. But first, we're going to have more preview of the vice presidential debate and the most difficult questions both candidates tonight could see after these words from our sponsors. Welcome back to Farmville in the Old Dominion. We're back here at Longwood University ahead of tonight's vice presidential debate. Let's be honest, chances are that if we're still talking about this debate a week from now, it's because one of the vice presidential candidates probably had a horrible, horrible night. So, John, if you had to choose one thing that could trip Mike Pence up tonight and make him the news in a negative way, what would it be?
I think I mentioned earlier that I think that Tim Kaine is going to be relentless in trying to drive a wedge between Trump and Pence. And I imagine he's prepared for it. But if there's some place where his body language or his words give evidence of the notion that he's not where Trump is, trying to defend one of these outrageous things Trump has said or many of these controversies, I can imagine that would create a big problem for him.
Yeah. I mean, the press is really looking at this as much as anything. And I think if Pence says something accidentally that reinforces a negative narrative about Trump,
right,
I think if it's a soundbite like that, that's his biggest danger for him. But he's a very disciplined guy, and he has skillfully navigated this exact dynamic almost flawlessly throughout the campaign. So I think that would be his biggest problem. I don't think it's going to happen.
I think the other thing you could do is if he goes overboard in his praise for Trump, right? Because in the way that Hillary Clinton has sought to use the word genius to kind of mock Trump, you can imagine if Pence tries to validate him too much or too extravagantly.
Oh, I think he'll do that.
But if he does it too extravagantly, you can imagine
pretty extravagantly.
That might turn up in a campaign ad.
Yeah,
you know?
He does it pretty extravagantly.
All right, so let me turn the question around now and ask you about Kaine. Same question. If there's one thing you think that could trip up Tim Kaine, what would it be?
I have an instinct. I may be wrong. No, I have an instinct that Pence may go after Hillary Clinton's ethics in a way that, or Bill Clinton's, that will put Kaine in a tough position. And I'm sure he's prepared for it.
Yeah.
But if he said, was Bill Clinton, last night, New Hampshire, one of our Senate candidates was asked if Donald Trump's a good role model. Was Bill Clinton a good role model for young people in the 1990s?
Right.
Something like that, where I think I think that he would have trouble answering.
Right. I think the one place where Kaine is safe is in defending his own record.
Yeah.
I mean, Kaine on the death penalty, people forget, they're hitting him now in this kind of Willie Horton-ish way. Kaine's had to make that argument multiple times in Virginia. He's very comfortable defending the places where he's...
And I don't think Pence is going to waste much time.
Well, I agree with you, but I'm just saying it's like, the Republicans have been raising that issue. I think Kaine will have great answers on that front.
I think they raise that to just get in his head.
The most awkward things about the Clintons, I think, is where you're right.
Yeah.
There's a place where you can imagine him getting in an awkward spot. Yeah. And Tim Kaine is a very, he's a very good guy. I mean good with kind of a capital G. He's kind of a goody two-shoes, right? He's not used to having to answer questions about some of those awkwardnesses
and he had some,
in the Clinton background.
some statements in the past that were critical of Bill Clinton.
Yes, sure.
And so and I predict Pence may pull those out and say, that's what you said then, what are you saying now? One of the big variables we don't know is Elaine Quijano is not nearly as well known a commodity.
Right.
What kind of focus will she have tonight? To what extent will she put these people on the defensive? Going to be a fascinating thing to see. She's not been discussed nearly as much as, say, Lester Holt was in advance of the first debate. All right, so you can tune in for our live streaming coverage of the vice presidential debate. Bloomberg Politics has teamed up exclusively with Twitter. We're going to give you a pre- and post-game debate coverage. It all starts at 8:30 Eastern Time. You can follow us if you want to watch on Twitter on @BPolitics. The pregame, the debate itself, and then the post-game wrap-up, all streaming live on Bloomberg Television and on Twitter. We'll have more from Farmville right after this.
You know what I'm talking about.
Welcome back. We're here on the campus of Longwood University awaiting tonight's vice presidential debate, and we are joined now by MSNBC political correspondent Casey Hunt and NBC News correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Ladies, it's
excited to be here.
Always a pleasure to be graced by your presence. What is the single most interesting thing you know, Casey, about the vice president, by the debate taking place in either camp?
The single most interesting thing I know, I would say the idea that they are trying to prep Tim Kaine to be an attack dog, and how they've tried to deal with kind of the balance between helping, using his Mr. Nice Guy persona to make her seem more likable to an audience, while at the same time not letting up on Mike Pence. And I think one of the things that they've been worried about in preparation is this idea that Mike Pence is potentially a more disciplined, person to actually go after Tim Kaine than, say, Donald Trump was
Potentially.
with
That's
Hillary Clinton.
potentially
being
more
generous.
Potentially more disciplined. What's the most interesting thing you know about debate prep on the other side?
I think that Mike Pence is actually digging into Tim Kaine's gubernatorial record, his record in the Senate, in ways that I think voters may not expect to hear about what he did when he was in charge as an executive in a campaign where they really are the second fiddle. So I think they would use that to say that Tim Kaine, for example, would have raised taxes as the governor of Virginia. Mike Pence, taxes have gone down in Indiana. That kind of argument, the employment numbers, trying to find things about Tim Kaine that they can attach to the larger narrative of what the Trump campaign hopes to accomplish. That and barbecue after debate prep is what I understand is really the thing for Tim Kaine.
Thing for Tim Kaine.
So it's important.
The Clinton, both these candidates, Trump and Clinton, tend to, when things are going well, then the pendulum starts to swing back. She's on a pretty good run. She's performing well in the stump. The polls are moving in her direction. Trump's having all these problems. Do you have a sense of what their current concerns are?
I think that their current concerns are making sure that they try to stem her losses with white working class men. If you look at both the places where she's going in these battleground states, we were in Ohio, in places that, we were not in predominantly African American areas of Ohio. She is not necessarily talking about things that deviate from this economic message they have that's designed to resonate with those voters. I think that if they feel like if they can cut their losses there, then they're going to be in good shape. The challenge is if all of these things don't ultimately resonate in the polls, and in Ohio we haven't necessarily seen it.
Right. One of the things that is true about the Trump campaign is when the Republican Party establishment is in panic, it's harder for them to get good news stories because there's so many people being quoted. August, they were in panic. Trump had a couple good weeks they were out. Where are they now after 8 days of bad coverage for Donald Trump?
I think there is sort of a partial paralysis. I think there is an inability to know how to respond to some of these things. I think when they're making the argument that Trump's tax issue, for example, was within the law, when you're arguing it's within the law, you kind of are a little bit behind.
Yeah.
I think
Although
there's also
Paul Ryan said he didn't think it was a big deal.
Not a big deal there.
By that.
Yes, that he went a little further than perhaps he wanted to.
Yeah.
And I think there's still so much constriction on the part of establishment Republicans. They don't want to be drawn in.
It seems to me that they were panicked in August, and now they're just kind of used to it. It's the new normal for them. Is our nominee can have a week more horrendous than we could ever have imagined, and we just need to deal with it.
The hard part, I think, is how many days left, because when there's been a bad week, is there a rebound moment? And after the first debate performance, do they think the next debate is that rebound moment for him to reclaim some momentum if Pence isn't able to turn the dial at all tonight?
One thing we haven't mentioned on this program so far is the fact that Donald Trump is going to be live tweeting this debate. And for those of us who are here,
that's worth saying twice.
Donald Trump is going to be live tweeting the debate. The Clinton campaign, Jennifer Palmieri came out this afternoon and said, "Great, fantastic." How much do you think, on a scale of 1 to Godzilla, how excited is the Clinton campaign at the prospect of Trump live tweeting this?
I'm going to go with Godzilla. Is there something larger than Godzilla? I'm not sure.
Godzilla plus Rodan.
I don't have anything at the tips of my fingers.
That Donald Trump would fat shame.
Oh, okay. That's a fair point. No, yeah, they're totally excited. And Mike Pence isn't going to have any idea what's going on either while he's standing on the stage.
Which is interesting because he will be in his own orbit, trying to be the good running mate, trying to only make good news or none at all. And there will be the spirit, the kind of ethereal Twitter spirit of Trump.
Can you imagine the reply tweets that are going to come from Brian Fallon?
I don't want to take this too lightly. It seems to me on some level insane. Just because you're taking
by the normal playbook, it's not the way to go.
And also something that seems reflective of or indicative of the notion that still at this late date, even after everything that happened last week, there's no one in Trump's orbit who can keep him off the Twitter machine.
I also think there might be a hint of him recognizing that he missed opportunities in his first debate. And Mike Pence, if anything, has prepared and is disciplined and perhaps Trump can try to use those
Amplify.
140 characters
Right.
to amplify
Amplify,
and to redirect. I think it's a tacit admission that he missed on some key issues that could have been arguments he could have made against
Yeah, I
Hillary
think it
Clinton.
could give Pence a chance to actually get more attention, and I think that he has a chance to talk to voters that Trump right now is talking past. Suburban women, Republicans in suburbs that people that are voting for Rob Portman, but they can't conceive of voting for Donald Trump.
And substance, right? They want to go for some substance.
That's right. The most common thing that occurs to a vice presidential nominee by this phase is some frustration. The campaign's not running the way they want. They're not being used the way they want. Does Tim Kaine have any frustration, or is he just happy to be here?
He seems like the eternal happy warrior. I mean, this is a guy who, still remembers the sting of not getting chosen, was very much interested in taking this job, and has really kind of come into his own. We have Kailani Koenig is somebody, she covers Tim Kaine for NBC News, and has kind of documented how he has really figured out a nice spot, and I know that the Clinton campaign is happy with him also.
Pence obviously has the potential to be more frustrated. What is he?
I think that the reviews have been better than anyone expected. His ability to put a sunnier spin on some of the rough moments for Donald Trump, to adhere to the message they want to make, and he's enlarged his own profile greatly. And so I think Pence has enjoyed it, and I think the campaign is happy with how he's performed.
For those within the Trump campaign, like Paul Manafort, who pushed for Pence over Christie or Gingrich, can you imagine if Christie or Gingrich were on the ticket during these rough periods, what it would have been like?
It would have been an entirely different campaign.
Yeah.
And I think that people didn't fully appreciate the ways that Pence could help, the voters he could speak to, and the sense of calm he could bring to the ticket. The second name on the ticket matters here.
Can I just say, I was so surprised to hear Pence swear in public.
Yes, today.
They dispute that, actually, because I talked to some people, and they think that he may have just been tripping over words, not intentionally. Although it got a lot of fire.
It's very out of character.
Yes.
Just to be clear, it's the S word we're referring to here.
Yes.
A word that
Sugar.
Sugar. Yeah, sweetness. Here's my last question, which is, we just discussed earlier. I was talking to a couple of people around Pence's debate prep today. It's very clear what a victory for Mike Pence would be, making voters feel a little more comfortable about Donald Trump. What's the clear victory for Tim Kaine tonight?
I think a clear victory for Tim Kaine is making Mike Pence answer for some of these things that Donald Trump has said, and honestly, being deft in handling questions about problems on Hillary Clinton's record. Because if he makes a mistake there, we're going to see it on repeat for a while.
All right, Casey Hunt, Kelly O'Donnell, you guys are awesome, fantastic, wonderful, and sugar. Up next, Clinton campaign surrogate Senator Amy Klobuchar will stop by our set, and we'll be right back with more from the Longwood University debate.
get real. Franklin Roosevelt said in 1932 that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The only thing, Jim, they have to offer is fear.
That was, of course, the 1996 vice presidential debate between Al Gore and Jack Kemp, St. Petersburg, Florida. With us now, the gentlelady from Minnesota, Amy Klobuchar, who's been traveling around helping Hillary Clinton and other Democrats.
From the state of vice presidents, too.
From the state of vice presidents, where all the vice presidents are above average. Or at least.
Where the moms bounce their babies on their knees and say one day you can grow up to be vice president, as in Mondale and Humphrey.
Yeah.
And Tim Kaine, born in St. Paul.
Right. Why does this debate matter to the outcome of the presidential race?
Well, I think, first of all, you're going to see, from the Tim Kaine perspective, he's going to have the opportunity to lay out her economic plan and some of the approaches to foreign policy that are so different than Donald Trump's. And I don't think that you can neglect what happened in the last week. That has got to be part of the discussion, but I also think it'll be maybe just a little bit lower wattage than last week, so there'll be time for some economic discussions that I think is very important. The fact that Donald Trump was shown to build up nearly $1 billion in debt in 1 year, and relating that to his economic plan, which puts $5 trillion in debt on the backs of American people. I think there's a connection between what we've been hearing about this week and what the actual economic policies are.
I get a lot from a lot of Democrats, both on the Twitter machine and elsewhere, people saying, why aren't people raising Mike Pence's record in Indiana more often? Why don't people talk about his record on gay and lesbian issues, et cetera, et cetera? Is it smart for Kaine to focus on those issues tonight, or should he be more focused on the top of the ticket?
Well, given what's going on, say, in North Carolina, where I was just visiting, where that is a major issue, given that the NBA has pulled out and NCAA has pulled out, you've got PayPal that has decided not to do a major expansion because of a similar issue of what happened in Indiana, which was a discriminatory law that was signed into law in North Carolina and in Indiana by Governor Pence that really scared businesses away. They made a minor change in Indiana, but it's still a problem, and I think that will be fair game even if you look at the economy and what is an economy that works for all Americans, not just a few.
Donald Trump has a new ad out today talking about his plan for tax breaks for child care. Do you applaud his talking about that issue?
I think it's good when we get anything out there on child care, on work-family leave. On the other hand, having not looked at his child care policy, I will say the work-family leave one, to me, is not nearly as good as the one that Hillary Clinton is proposing. So I think it's important to talk about the issues, but I think it's also important to look at what the actual policies are. And these next 3 debates, including this one, will give us a chance to do that.
Let me come back to the question I asked you a second ago, just in a slightly broader way, right?
Okay.
There's one way to talk about. There's 2 different ways you could kind of go after Mike Pence. One is you could say he's a conservative extremist, right? The other is to try to find the places where he's more reasonable in some ways than Donald Trump and try and drive a wedge through that. What's the better way to try to approach this debate? Try to find those places where there's daylight between the 2 of them, and those make him seem like kind of the moderate one relative to Trump.
So my guess is there'll be some discussions about, of course, because there's going to be questions because you've got 2 people running for vice president, so some questions about Pence, and I'm sure that Senator Kaine will raise some of those issues. I think the major piece of this, though, is the fact that you have Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. Pence releases his taxes. Trump doesn't release his taxes. Pence has been known of having a more mild manner. I think he called himself, he called himself a Rush Limbaugh on decaf because he did radio. Right. Well, his problem here is that he's running with the guy, Donald Trump, who's a Rush Limbaugh on Red Bull. So, that's a problem.
That's like a debate line that you just came up with there.
Well, it's free to use. The problem is I've taken it away now.
That was very workshopped, that line.
You can use it again.
You think so?
Yeah,
because I kind of stumbled over it a little bit.
Yeah,
that didn't add to it.
Republicans are making a big deal about some remarks Bill Clinton made about the Affordable Care Act, where he seemed to be critical of it. Let me ask you, which parts of the Affordable Care Act do you think are not working well, if any?
Okay, well, first of all, I'm the one that worked with Senator Orrin Hatch on suspending the medical device tax. That's a tax on manufacturing. You have people as liberal as Elizabeth Warren that think that tax wasn't a good idea. I think that's something that we should look at in the long term.
That's about fun. That's about funding.
I have a few of the things. I think we need to do a bill that makes changes changes to it. I think there are severe problems in terms of pharmaceutical prices, and I'd like to see negotiation under Medicare Part D, doing more in terms of these deals that go on between generics and pharma companies where they pay them. It's like $3 billion we could save if we stop those deals. That's a bill I have with Chuck Grassley. I think there are, on a bipartisan basis, things we can do to bring pharma prices down. The exchanges, the fact some of it's because of pharma, some of it's because some issues with how we manage those exchanges. I think there's a lot we can do on a bipartisan basis, but every time we've tried to do it, the Republicans have said, well, let's just repeal the whole thing, and no one wants to get rid of having your kids on the insurance.
I've heard you do that list before. So my point was, you seem to have no problem criticizing aspects of the Affordable Care Act, as Bill Clinton did. So what, do you think Republicans are making any political hay or any legitimate point to say he's trashing the Affordable Care Act?
No, I think what he has said, and most importantly, what Hillary Clinton has said, you can look right on her website, is that we have to look at some changes, and she's certainly been out there on the cost of prescription drugs. To me, as I said when we passed it, it was a beginning and not an end, and there's still a lot of work that needs to be done.
Let me ask you a question that Mark hypothesized earlier in this show, kind of question that Tim Kaine could get tonight, okay? Last night on stage at her senatorial debate, Kelly Ayotte was asked whether Donald Trump is a good role model for Americans, and she stumbled over that. If you were Tim Kaine, you were asked the question, was Bill Clinton a good role model for Americans? What would you say to that?
I would say that Bill Clinton was a fantastic president in terms of what he has done and what he accomplished. Did he have some flaws? Yes, those have been well litigated. But overall, when you look at what he did for the economy, what he did in terms of stabilizing our country after we had accumulated a major debt, those were really good things. And he did have some flaws. On the other hand, when I look at role models between these two people, the people who were actually on the ticket, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, there's no comparison to me. When Michelle Obama stood there on that convention floor and said she thinks about her daughters playing in front of that White House with their dog in a White House that was built by slaves, and that she thinks about the role of the president is not just that they have their finger on the nuclear code, but that also they're a role model for the country, for little kids everywhere. And you have someone that is divisive, that is constantly pitting Americans against each other. That is not the role model we want in this country or the world. Hillary Clinton, look, at every young girl in the world is going to see that the President of the United States is a woman, and a strong one at that.
Senator Amy Klobuchar demonstrating why she wouldn't have been a bad pick to be on the ticket.
As we say in Minnesota, nailed it.
Yeah.
That's a good answer,
That's pretty good. I hope Tim Kaine was watching. Tim Kaine was watching that. That's a pretty good masterclass.
Senator, thanks very much. Welcome to Farmville.
Okay. I'm having a great time in Farmville. It reminds me of home.
Up next, we talk about Trumpocrats and whether they're the next Reagan Democrats, the man leading a group trying to get Democrats on board for Donald Trump, as well as a Trump senior advisor, right after this.
my hair.
That was third-party candidate Ross Perot's running mate, Admiral James Stockdale, expressing a degree of confusion bordering on existential befuddlement when he made his debut in the national spotlight in the 1992 vice presidential debate against Al Gore and Dan Quayle. We are just hours away from another vice presidential debate here at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia. Joining us now is Christian Rickers, the executive director of Trumpocrats PAC. That's a super PAC of former Democrats supporting the Republican nominee. And also here is Sarah Huckabee Sanders, a senior advisor for the Trump campaign. Folks, great to see you both. Hillary Clinton just was doing a press conference just as we've been doing this show. She says that Mike Pence has a huge burden in defending his own record and Donald Trump's. So, A, do you think there's any truth in that there's a big burden? And if there's a burden for Mike Pence, what's the most burdensome thing he's going to have to do tonight?
I think it's pretty laughable for Hillary Clinton to say that Mike Pence has a big burden tonight. Tim Kaine's got to answer for 30 years of failed public service by Hillary Clinton. She's a career politician. She has nothing to show for it. And I think that's a pretty big burden, and certainly much bigger than the successful business record that Mike Pence gets to tout for Donald Trump, and his own personal record of success of governor, of cutting taxes, lowering unemployment. He's made Indiana a better place, and I think he's got a great story to tell, and I hope he gets a chance to do that tonight.
Am I right that you've been a supporter of Bernie Sanders and of Barack Obama?
That's right.
So if you look at their issue positions, they would seem a lot closer to Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. Why are you trying to get Democrats to be for Trump compared to Sanders and Obama, who you've supported?
Well, I grew up in a small town just 30 miles south of here, and when 20 years ago there were 15 manufacturing facilities, and now there's one. And there's nobody more responsible for those job losses than the Clintons. So that's the main issue for me. People can't provide for their families. People are underemployed. They are, it's just, we have to.
I don't want to minimize trade and jobs. It's a huge issue, but is that it? Are you a single issue Trump voter over Clinton?
Well, I also think that she's sort of unelectable. I call her the Pied Piper of greed. These are people who left the White House dead broke, and now they are worth over $250 million, all off of selling influence all over the world, and it's unconscionable.
Do you? It's clear that tonight's debate, Tim Kaine is going to find places where try to go after places where Mike Pence and Donald Trump disagree. There have been some places where that's been the case. What are the areas? Again, just speak to what you think are the areas of where the job will be trickiest for Pence, if not burdensome, trickiest in terms of trying to navigate, like on that question, where he and Donald Trump are not in the same place.
Look, I think on the big issues that most Americans care about, they are positively aligned. You're never going to find any two people. I don't care. Even my dad and I disagree, and we're pretty ideologically very similar. So you're not always going to be perfect. I think the bigger question is.
How do you think Mike Pence will answer the question of how what his view is of how Donald Trump talked about Alicia Machado last week, for instance?
Look, I think, again, Mike Pence has a great place to talk from, particularly given Hillary Clinton has said by far the most offensive thing, not just in this race, but that I think I've ever heard in modern politics when she called millions of Americans deplorable.
I appreciate that, but it's just not kind of directly responsive to the question, right? I mean, how do you think Mike Pence should answer that question? How do you feel about the nominee's treatment of Alicia Machado last week? You were Mike Pence, you would say what?
Look, I would say what I just said, that the most offensive thing hasn't been what Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton may have said about one another. The most offensive thing has not just come from what Hillary Clinton has said, but frankly what she's done. I'm a lot more concerned about what one candidate has done in 30 years than I am what one candidate may have said that may offend some people.
So your basic answer would be pivot and ignore the question.
Not ignore the question. I think you have to look at the context of the overall race. We're talking about what one candidate has said and what one candidate has done. And what Hillary Clinton has done is a pay-to-play scandal, an email scandal. I think she has made herself disqualified from being president, and Donald Trump hasn't. And I think you have to point that out. You have to draw that contrast. I think he's prepared to do that.
Are you and your PAC asking Democrats to leave the Democratic Party or just to cast a one-off vote for Donald Trump?
This is specifically to the presidential election. After we leave this debate, we're going to Pittsburgh, and we're doing a trip over 5 days from Pittsburgh to Cleveland and distributing over 10,000 yard signs and materials. We're making stops in Youngstown and the Mahoning Valley, and there are hundreds of thousands of Democrats in both of those states who have already either switched their registration to try to vote for Donald Trump in the primary. We also have 850,000 names in 10 counties, specific in Pennsylvania to western Pennsylvania, that are ripe for our message, and we're going to go after them, turn them out, and it's going to make a difference in the election.
I know you'd like to see Trump win. Would you like to see Republicans control the Senate as well?
That is not the focus of this effort. It is squarely on the presidential election.
And how much have you raised? How much will you raise?
We have raised $200,000, and we have a commitment for 1.2 before the end of the month.
And
we got to get the money in the door, of course.
What state, if you picked one, where you
Pennsylvania.
say Pennsylvania?
That's it.
Okay.
Ground zero.
Okay.
All right.
Great.
Christian Rickers, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, it's great to have you. Thank you for doing the show. And we'll talk to two of Washington's finest reporters after we let these folks set them free and come back after this quick break. If you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Who are you supporting this election?
Trump.
And you are supporting?
Hillary Clinton.
I'm supporting Hillary.
And you're supporting?
Donald Trump.
Is there anything that you guys think you could agree on? Do you think there's bias in the media?
Definitely.
Oh, absolutely.
I feel like everybody's been ducking the tough questions.
I can agree with that as well.
What sports do you like?
Football and basketball, I'd say.
That's an easy one, right?
Football, yeah. Climate change is real. So
Climate change is real, that's good?
So that's great to hear.
Would you be okay if the wall didn't happen?
Yes.
So that's a step in the right direction. That's good. What's the bar situation like in Farmville?
None. Non-existent. There is no bar.
They had one and they moved it.
Do we need a new bar in Farmville?
Yes, we do.
We need a new one. I can agree on that one.
If any candidate came out and was like, new bar in Farmville, you guys would be like, hell yeah.
Bar in Farmville 2016.
Our colleague Matt Negrin showing that there's more that unites us than divides us, at least on some issues. At a time when most Democrats and Republicans are on TV biting each other's heads off, we decided to bring in two people who are universally well-liked. Phil Rucker of the Washington Post and our Bloomberg colleague, John McCormick.
I don't like either one of them very much, frankly. But
Phil,
all right.
What are you looking to have happen this evening? What do you have your eye on when the debate gets started at 9 Eastern?
So it's a debate with Mike Pence and Tim Kaine, but it's really all about Trump and Hillary Clinton. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how Mike Pence handles all of these Trump controversies, and I think he's going to have to account for a number of things just in the last week, but over the course of the entire campaign. Does he defend Trump entirely on everything? Is there going to be any daylight between them? That's what I think the story is going to be out of this.
Yeah. You're a longtime Pence watcher. It seems to me that one thing that he could help with is the Republican brand, just getting people to feel good about the brand and the ticket. Does he have that in him?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it'll be interesting to watch. I agree with Phil. He's got to sort of thread the needle between keeping social conservatives happy and being true to his record, which is one of, serious conservatism, and also trying to sort of, not disagree with things that Donald Trump has said. And the two of them, there are gaps between the two of them when it comes to policy and when it comes to, rhetoric and sort of their take on the campaign.
We have invoked the word Farmville several times in this show already. This is the setting for the debate. We've also invoked a little bit, there's a home field advantage here because Tim Kaine is, of course, from Virginia. But talk a little bit about what Farmville is and what the history is here and why that could, in a very specific way, give Kaine a talking point tonight.
Yeah, there's a really rich history here. Farmville was the epicenter of the civil rights movement here in Virginia. The schools were segregated at a time, and then it became part of the Brown v. Board of Education case that we all know about from history, and this is really where the integration happened. And it's a sad history. I think it's something that Tim Kaine will probably talk a lot about, especially given his own past. He was a civil rights lawyer, and his father-in-law helped desegregate or integrate the schools rather here in Virginia.
Linwood Holden, Republican governor of Virginia, who integrated the schools in the state throughout back in the early 70s. What do you think about what a victory would look like for Tim Kaine tonight?
I think a victory for Tim Kaine would be getting Mike Pence off of his speaking points. He's a very disciplined guy who rarely says something that's off message, off his speaking points. If Kaine can somehow rattle him in any way, the way Hillary Clinton was able to rattle Donald Trump last week, I think that would be a victory.
So what rattles Mike Pence? Again, as a student of Pence.
I don't think a lot does. I mean, he's pretty cool and calm, and he's more used to sort of the radio world than the television world, but he's pretty comfortable on television, and I think it will be difficult to rattle him tonight.
Looking forward to the town hall, the presidential debate Sunday night. Trump seems to be practicing. He did a kind of a warm-up with some veterans yesterday. What's your current sense of whether Trump will excel in that format more than he did in the first one?
It's a tough format for him. I mean, it's more than just your answers. It's your body language. It's how you interact with the voters who ask the questions. He'll be moving around the stage. What does he do physically when Hillary Clinton is talking? How does he react to her? I mean, those are big tests, and it's something I know he's thinking about. He's practicing. He's getting coaching from Chris Christie, who has excelled in those formats in town halls in New Jersey. So we'll see if he can process all of what he's hearing and really improve his performance. I think that's the big question mark.
We had a North Carolina poll this week. The horse race showed a pretty close race. What else in that poll interested you, since North Carolina is one of the states that's going to decide this?
Well, obviously, one thing that was interesting was the Clinton is not quite there with black voters in terms of the way Obama was. It's fairly obvious, first African-American president, first person to win North Carolina. So she's got to make some more improvement with blacks in North Carolina and nationally. She's doing well with women. She could always do better. Same problem, white working class voters in North Carolina, just like everywhere else.
What do you think a victory looks like tonight for Mike Pence?
Not having a mistake and just sort of getting through a lot of what should be pretty tough questioning from the moderator and from Tim Kaine. And if he can come out with a wash, that's probably something of a victory, because it would at least kind of stabilize things on their campaign. But we'll see. It's a tall order.
Phil Rucker, Washington Post, John McCormick of Bloomberg. Thank you both. John and I will be right back.
At 8:30 p.m. this evening, Mark and I will be hosting a pregame debate show right here from Longwood University. That coverage will, of course, be on Bloomberg Television, but it'll also be live streaming on Twitter. Go to debates.twitter.com or follow us at BPolitics. We will have pre-debate analysis and guest interviews, followed by the whole debate live from your smartphone, your laptop, your Apple TV, your Xbox, whatever. Again, it starts at 8:30 p.m. and lasts all night long.
We'll be back here at 8:30, but coming up now on Bloomberg West, Emily Chang sits down with Mark Cuban to talk about Donald Trump. You won't want to miss that. We'll see you at 8:30 for the pregame, the debate, and the postgame. Thanks for watching. Sayonara.
I'm Mark Crumpton. You're watching Bloomberg West. Let's begin with a check of your first word news. Vice presidential candidates Tim Kaine and Mike Pence hold their first and only debate tonight at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia. Pundits aren't expecting many, if any, fireworks. Kaine and Pence are considered two of America's most mild-mannered political figures. Bloomberg TV will provide coverage of the debate beginning at 8:30 p.m. New York time. Hurricane Matthew, which forecasters are calling the most powerful Atlantic storm in about a decade, slammed into western Haiti today, leaving 2 people dead. 4 others were killed in neighboring Dominican Republic. The storm's on track to deliver a glancing blow to Florida before spinning up the East Coast. United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is urging the U.S. and Russia to resume negotiations on Syria. He says he's been holding talks in Brussels with U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian officials. He says a ceasefire is vital to supply aid to the war-ravaged city of Aleppo. Meantime, Russia's transported an air defense system to Syria to help protect one of its naval facilities there. The move comes a day after the U.S. suspended talks with Russia on how to better coordinate airstrikes. The ceasefire brokered by Washington and Moscow collapsed last month. Global news 24 hours a day, powered by more than 2,600 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. Bloomberg West is next.
And this is Bloomberg West. Coming up, Google gambles on smartphones. We'll break down their strategy for the $400 billion market and plans to take on Apple. Plus, our exclusive interview with early Twitter investor Chris Sacca. why he's, quote, disappointed in Jack Dorsey and hoping Twitter gets bought. And first on Bloomberg, our sit down with serial entrepreneur and famed investor Mark Cuban, who holds nothing back on Donald Trump. But first, to our lead. Google takes its biggest leap yet into the $400 billion smartphone hardware market. After years of outsourcing development to other phone makers, Google is now taking the Apple approach and developing phones from end to end in-house. Rick Osterloh is the chief of Google's new hardware division. Take a listen.
Phones are the most important device we own. They rarely leave our side. They're literally most people's lifeline to the internet and to each other. So today, I'm very excited to introduce you to a new phone made by Google. We call it Pixel.
Besides this, Google also took the opportunity to unveil a handful of other consumer electronics, including a speaker device to take on the Amazon Echo and a mobile headset meant to spread VR to the masses. Joining me now to break it all down, the entire Google hardware family, Forrester Research Vice President Julie Ask, Bloomberg News reporters Mark Bergen, who covers Google for us, and Mark Gurman. And Mark Bergen, this is your first time with me, so just want to welcome you here to Bloomberg and Bloomberg West. But you were all at the event today. And Mark, I want to start with you, Gurman. What stands out to you most about what Google unveiled?
Definitely the Amazon Echo-like speaker. That's definitely the most interesting thing to me today. We really expected the Pixel smartphones and that strategy, but they announced new software development kits, 2 of them, one to connect to apps, one to connect to the other devices you have in your house. So it's interesting that they're going after that home market from 2 different angles.
Julie, you're nodding.
Yeah, actually, I don't think the hardware announcements today were that interesting. I think the most interesting thing that came out of today was them showcasing just how good the Google Assistant is and talking about the strategy to put it on as many devices as they can. So it becomes this ubiquitous assistant to me. Anything, anywhere, anytime that I need, I go to Google first.
Mark B., how about you?
Yeah, I mean, to start off, Sundar Pichai, the CEO, began talking about machine learning and AI. It wasn't about hardware. Yeah. And the assistant was kind of the kind of motif that came through the entire event was, we built this assistant. We think it's better than anyone else has built. We think it's the next iteration of search, the next generation of mobile. It's becoming AI first world, and they want to get it to as many devices and places as possible.
Now, Mark Gurman, you spoke with Rick Osterloh, Google's head of hardware today. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
A lot of this is about rolling out the future strategy of Google centered around AI, machine learning, and the Google Assistant. And some of the hardware we brought to market really showcases the capabilities of it. We're excited because building hardware and software together makes it so we can innovate faster, bring more of the capabilities to the surface for our users.
I want to dig in on phones here because for so long Google has outsourced the production of phones. Now they're doing it in-house, all by themselves. Do we think that this could be game-changing to the smartphone market? Obviously, Android has huge market share, but Google-specific devices, the Nexus hasn't necessarily done well.
I don't think it's a game changer today. I think it's an introduction to the game changing down the line. A lot of the Google executives that we talked to after the event and before the event are indicating that this is more of a journey. Every year, Google's going to do more and more and more. This year, they're starting with a custom controller to make touchscreen response times on the Android Pixel phones more faster, as well as new camera, custom work on the chipset there. But over time, you'll see more custom work, wireless modem testing, other chips. So I think down the road, that will become a big game changer and will seriously cause concern